Megan, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So we got in touch. I was doing some research on this whole topic of cross generational communication in the workplace, and your name, your book, your research came up. So why don't we get started with you telling us about who you are and what you've researched?
Absolutely. Well, I am a professor of management and leadership at the Farmer School of Business at Miami University, which is in Ohio. I've been there for 20 years now. I am a researcher of really individual differences in the workplace and how we can better leverage those to create higher levels of motivation, performance, innovation, all those great things that we hope happen for all of our organizations. And then, in addition to that, I'm also director of leadership development for the school. And then, what brings me, of course, to you today is I am author of a book called Gentelligence, the revolutionary approach to leading an intergenerational workforce. So that book came out in 2021. I co-authored that with two former students of mine who are millennials. You cannot write a book about the power of generational diversity by yourself. That's a little bit hypocritical. So we tried
Yeah.
to, practice what we preach on that. That book is really the product of a lot of years of both consulting and research and speaking that I had done on the topic and a different way to approach it. And then it led to our 2022 article that came out in Harvard Business Review as their big idea piece in March, which was all about leveraging the power of age diversity. So that's my background in a nutshell, but really just trying to bring a different lens to this intergenerational conversation in the workplace.
That's fantastic. And before we dive into all that, tell us a bit more about what you're doing now. I mean, the book came out 2 years ago now, and how have things evolved for you since then?
Yeah, it's been great. I think we've been pleasantly, I won't say surprised, but pleasantly, you know, encountering a lot of interest, increased interest, of course, since the book came out, since the HBR came out, from industries really across the board. So, just about everything you could think of, people are having this challenge, whether it's in education, sports, retail, tech, entertainment, the restaurant industry, healthcare, you name it. I One of my favorite things is opening my inbox to see, who's coming and saying we really are struggling with this, or sometimes, not often, but sometimes people saying I think there's a huge opportunity here. We'd like to really be proactive in tapping into it. So it's certainly a topic that everyone is talking about. There's interesting commonalities, but also really unique challenges, I think, depending on the industry. So I am keeping, of course, really busy teaching classes. Our semester just started this week, but also doing so much speaking and consulting across these industries to help organizations retain their talent, whether that's baby boomer talent that is not sure whether they have a future in that particular organization, whether it's attracting the enigma that is currently Gen Z, or those of us in between, how to make sure you're engaging and developing people. So I think in the midst of this post-pandemic shift in leadership and not quite understanding the role that work is going to play for people moving forward, this topic, for all kinds of reasons, has become quite sticky. So I
Hmm.
love just sort of finding the conversations that come up when I'm speaking and doing consulting. So, conversations, of course, around workplace flexibility. So, should we get everybody back in the office or not? Are there interesting age based differences there to be aware of? Anything from that to different generational norms on talking about mental health in the workplace or giving feedback in
Hmm.
the workplace. There's always different topics that are catching people's attention in this area. So I'm really just trying to continue these conversations, help come up with more productive ways to approach them that are going to increase the workplace experience of everyone across their lifespan in organizations.
Yeah. So you've identified a number of these challenges, these topics that come up and have a generational aspect to them. Let's dive in more into one of these. Let's say you'd mentioned boomers trying to keep their spot or find a good way to maintain their contribution. How is that playing out, and what opportunities are there to resolve that issue?
Sure. So, of course, our boomers were the largest population in our workplace for such a long time. Millennials took over that just a few years ago. So, for probably the last 10 to 15 years, we've been hearing there's going to be this, it's called all kinds of things, silver tsunami. There's going to be this mass exodus of our baby boomers who, for so long, have set the climate in organizations. And of course, it didn't happen in the way that anyone anticipated. First, it was that baby boomers as a whole were working longer, which was fantastic because they were living longer, greater health. Of course, the strong, and I am very careful about not stereotyping generations in my work. That's such
Mm.
a tough, it's a tough balance. I'm sure we'll get into this today, but I try really hard to value and think about the unique norms of a generation without falling into stereotypes, because I think that's a huge problem
Mm.
we have in the area of understanding generational differences. So, as a whole, though, baby boomers had norms around success that were very much tied to workplace performance. I think that's a very safe thing to say. So the idea of when a baby boomer would want to retire is an interesting question. So we saw baby boomers being less interested in retirement. Post 2008, for financial reasons, many were not able to retire economically when they thought they could. So even before the pandemic, it was a tension where perhaps younger people in the workplace had been waiting for the baby boomer exodus to achieve higher levels of leadership, and that exodus was not coming. But with that was also this level of concern of how are we going to replace such a huge part of our workforce, whether that's just
Mm.
the sheer size of baby boomers. Gen X is so much smaller demographically. And also, have we done what we need to do to really do succession planning or transfer of knowledge from that generation to the next few generations that will be taking over? So then, post pandemic or during the pandemic, some baby boomers said it's not worth it to stay for health reasons or just, the chaos that was working for several years, and decided to retire. Some decided to not retire, but leave their organizations who either weren't giving them the flexibility they wanted, or just not feeling valued. And so now we're seeing really this interesting dichotomy. I think we hear from a lot of people trying to get back into the workforce who maybe were laid off. Who are boomers who feel like they're not necessarily being given those opportunities. So some concerns around ageism. And then we also see baby boomers who still want to work for another 10 or 15 years saying, well, I don't feel valued here. I'm feeling maybe nudged aside for younger workers. So I'm going to take my talent somewhere else. So I think you can't put all the baby boomer activity in the workplace in one category. But I think what we really want is for organizations to value and engage people until they're done with their career. When they say they're ready to go, make sure they're leveraging that unique expertise and wisdom, but also making sure they find ways for those baby boomers to be transferring their knowledge and expertise over time to the people that will eventually want to step into their shoes. So a lot of opportunities there that we need to explore further.
Yeah, to illustrate that point as a cautionary tale, perhaps, I have a mentor whose former employer had recently eliminated two entire layers of management and happened to be more boomers, Gen X people up there in those layers. And the people who made the hiring decisions were generally more millennial, and they sort of shot themselves in the foot because in an effort to be more inclusive, they forgot about the knowledge transfer and the age diversity thing. And so 4 centuries worth of company experience walked out the door, and now there's a lot of people that don't know how or don't know the company way of doing things, at least to do their jobs better. And so there, I've noticed that there can be a, a lack of consideration for this specific part in the whole equation of inclusion.
Absolutely. I think, baby boomers were dominant in the workplace for so long. And the dynamic of understanding or realizing that we have a lot to learn from people who are older has always just been assumed. We've always, it's of
Mm,
course different across cultures, but for a very long time, respect your elders, you learn from, your mentors who are older than you, was such a mainstay that I think a lot of organizations didn't worry too much about whether that transfer of knowledge would occur. And as we've seen, I think there's some very positive things about shifts we've seen, that the idea that learning needs to be two directional, that we can learn from younger
mm,
people who have developed an entirely different set of skills growing up than many of us did growing up, that we are learning. That's great, but I think it has fallen by the wayside that we often aren't either not appreciating or not putting systems in place to capture that knowledge. So I worked with clients, some of whom got a very tough awakening during COVID when either their older workers decided to step down, as I said, for health and safety reasons. There were some much more tragic stories of people that passed away from COVID unexpectedly, and it was a
mm,
higher percentage of people in that older age group. So that left a lot of organizations, in shock about the fact that those older people were no longer there. But I think a more common current I'm hearing, I did a panel discussion for encore.org a couple months ago. It was a really great discussion, great organization. And somebody in the chat, there were 600 or 700 people, I think, on the call. So the chat was quite active, as you would imagine. And I
mm,
don't always catch all the comments, but as I was talking, there was a gentleman in the chat who said something to the effect of, I'm 67 years old, I have so much to teach, but I don't feel like anyone's interested in learning from me. And it was a little bit heartbreaking, but also an interesting moment. So I stopped my commentary and I said, well, I'd love to talk about that, because our book, we found, a statistic, something like 21% of baby boomers report they haven't transferred any of their knowledge to the people that will replace them. That
wow.
stat's probably a little dated now, but I I think it's very interesting, because what we're hearing from many, and this is somewhat anecdotal, but what I'm hearing from many younger people is, I don't want to lecture. I don't want to lecture on how we did it back in the day, or this is how we do things here, because it tends to be perceived as, I don't love the phrase, but that's when you tend to get the okay boomer retort. Like, you,
Mm,
okay, great, we're all glad it worked back then. That doesn't mean it's going to work now, which of course is quite disrespectful. But how do we solve the problem is what I'm always interested in. So there's a lack of gentelligence on both sides. So gentelligence is just a word that I coined. It's probably been 7 or 8 years ago now. Just that we need to get smarter about these intergenerational dynamics. That's really what it means. How do we create opportunities and stop looking at it from a position of threat or conflict or frustration? So the opportunity there isn't that younger people just have to start listening more, or that older people need to change. It's on both sides. And so I engaged this gentleman in conversation and said, one of the things that works really well in terms of a strategy is, if you have something that you feel is really vital, timeless, important wisdom that we definitely need to know and understand, have you ever taken the first step to engage a younger colleague in asking their thoughts about that subject? Extending a bit of the olive
mm,
branch as the elder leader, person that in the organization, to say, here's something that I would love to talk to you about. I would love to hear your thoughts. What are your perspectives? What are you seeing here? As an entry point to then sharing your knowledge and expertise. Because I haven't found the younger generations don't want to learn from older people. I work with Gen Z every day. That's what I do as a professor. I found they're very much interested in it. but they really want to connect and have sort of a mutual respect, that they're not expected just to sit and listen, that they want to have a conversation. And so when I enter into a conversation with someone younger and say, well, let's talk about this topic. What are your thoughts? What are you seeing? What are your challenges around this? And then use
Mm.
that as the jumping off point to say, well, here's what I've learned about it. Do we think that still holds? Do you think there's a different, sort of challenge that you're seeing that doesn't fit what my experience has been? Instead of it being, a universal sort of here's how you do it, it's a conversation where learning occurs and wisdom is passed through more of a two-way interaction. And I think younger people, once they feel respected and they feel like their opinion has been, asked for or heard, are much more willing to listen and learn from that person. And of course, that's how that transfer of knowledge is going to occur.
And I love this topic because in my psychological readings, I've picked out a pattern of what exactly you're talking about of knowledge transfer, where what people want, and I'll speak personally here as a millennial. I've spent the past 10 years, all my 20s, pursuing mentorship, trying to learn from the people closest to me, the people that know the most. And it wasn't until recently that I began to see things from the other side, where I started to notice what value I bring to a mentorship relationship, where the mentor may have so much to offer in terms of wisdom, but I, as a mentee, actually give them something, which is hope, it's energy, it's an opportunity to extend their legacy, which I didn't appreciate until I started thinking from their perspective on that. And I think so much of what you were saying applies to this exercise because, like you're saying, it's not going to be a universal, this is the universal wisdom. It's a conversation of here's how it here's how I figured this out. Let's recontextualize this to a way that helps you. So it's the conversation of recontextualizing and that two-way street that really helps the relationship grow.
Absolutely. And I think that, we call that mutual mentoring in our book. And I'm setting up a mutual mentoring program through our leadership center for that reason, because one, every generation has really interesting perspective and experience and expertise that is different, but they don't have to be in competition. The fact that you
Mm.
know something I don't doesn't make my knowledge or wisdom less important. I don't need to be threatened by that. And unfortunately, I think that's the dynamic that plays out. It's fed by the media, it's fed by sort of this idea that there's a fixed pie, which sometimes is true, but I think often there's a lot more opportunity to collaborate. So the idea of, if it's you're a millennial, I'm a Gen Xer. So I could certainly say, I remember when I was at your stage of your career, these were the things that I was trying to figure out. Are you there, or are you at a different spot? How do you think that's different now? And as you share your experience, I love that word you use, contextualize. Like, given that boomers especially have been at this longer than you or I have, they do have the ability to help us contextualize. They can even saying, well, I've never had that particular experience, but here's something I've learned that I think might help you, is a wonderful way to teach. And what happens is it doesn't get perceived as, oh, great, I'm getting a one-way lecture where no one cares whether this is relevant to me. And I think for older people, the thing we have to get over, I'm now putting myself in the older people category because I'm a Gen Xer, so statistically I'm there. But I think what we have to realize is that it doesn't necessarily, it's not a threat to what we know, and that we have all kinds of interesting things that can, as you said, energize us, can help us realize that a lot of what we've learned is still relevant. And it can
Mm.
generate our own sort of engagement to think, well, let me walk through how my advice would differ or stay the same given what you're telling me. that's interesting. That's in the book
Mm.
we talk about this term called generativity, this idea that we want to help the next generation by sharing what we know, which becomes much more important the older we get. And if you think people aren't interested in that, that younger people aren't interested in your viewpoint, that of course can lead to tension and resentment and frustration, which is not what we need in this generational differences area. But instead, if you could enter in and think, well, I'm fascinated to see whether their experience is different than my experience and whether the things I've learned how to do, could still help them, even if the context is different. Like, let's have that conversation. I think there's so much opportunity there if we can step away from, you know, this idea that it's either my way or your way, and there's no sort of
Mm.
opportunity for us to blend those. I mean, I think that's really where the value is what could we figure out together with those different kinds of knowledge and perspective.
I love that. And what's coming to mind in the effort to create more awareness and perhaps empathy, and we're going to uh, run through the Gentelligent method, but before we hop into that 4-part method you came up with that I think is beautiful and wonderful, how about we go over some reference points that can help expand our mind on what someone might be experiencing that we haven't experienced. For instance, I have a number of mentors who, just in the past couple of years, have become empty nesters. Their kids are all grown now, and so it's a transition in their life. They are figuring things out. Some of them are experiencing crisis in ways that is interesting to observe. And then at the same time, I have a couple young kids. So we're all at different points in our lifespan. This is a different layer to generations, but perhaps give some examples of different reference points depending on where we're at in life that could help us understand each other better.
Sure. And I'm glad you brought that up. So, one of the big criticisms in I'm guessing maybe in other interviews you've done with people, this has come up that we often hear is, let's get rid of generations, or generations are reductionist, or generations are part of the
Mm.
problem. I don't subscribe to that idea. I think you could make that criticism about any way of grouping people, right? Anytime you're putting people
Mm.
into any category, you're being reductionist. I think really what we're concerned about is generational stereotypes, that somehow I know everything about you because you tell me the year you're born. It's sort of like a horoscope. I
Mm.
think really
Right.
bad, lazy generational work falls into that category, and I do not support that at all. What I support is the very interesting conversation about generational identity as one layer of who we are. So, if we think about the time in which we're born, the time in which we grow up, the time in which we start our careers and become adults, that is important. My son is 18. He is preparing to face a world of work that's very different than the one I faced when I was his age. That matters. There are some very common things to all 18 to 25-year-olds. That's a life stage. That's another layer of your identity. Career stage is another layer of your identity. Age. So, my most read blog post ever that I posted just on a whim because I had gotten a bunch of questions on it from talks I was doing was about being born in the cusp of two generations. What
Ah.
does that quote mean? And it's a great question. And it talks about the interaction between age and generation. I'm a younger Gen Xer. So what does that mean? Well, generations are a social construction. Someone decided, whether it was the Pew Research Center or someone else, most generations were split based on significant cultural events. And so it's not a law, but it's just a lens. And so it's a starting point to say, as a younger Gen Xer, I feel like I understand the perspective and the norms that were popular during my era of growing up, but I also probably have a better vantage point on older millennial norms because I'm kind of in between. That's interesting. That's great. And we can add layers of identity to that make it an even richer conversation. So when I speak to women's groups, I did one of those last week. What does it mean to be a female baby boomer or a Gen Z woman compared to a Gen X woman? How has the time in which you grew up affected norms in the workplace, specifically around the role your gender plays? Or we could do race or culture or, any
Mm.
socioeconomic status, you name it. So I love that depth and complexity. And when I meet that head on in all of the speaking I do, because people tend to be quite worried that they're going to be put in some box that doesn't fit for them. So when you say, absolutely, the fact that you are a first generation, American who's also a Black female who also happens to be a Gen Xer, that's all incredibly relevant to your perspective and your experience, and we're just talking about generation as one layer. So then to get back to your question about reference points, I talk in some of the work I do about this article I read in the Atlantic a couple summers ago, and it was titled something like "Millennials Refuse to Grow Up." So another one of
Hmm.
those horrible millennial headlines. And I actually love the Atlantic, so it's not a rip on the Atlantic, but the piece was talking about the demographic trends we're seeing around waiting to get married, waiting to buy a house, waiting to have children. And there was sort of a conclusion drawn that because of those delayed benchmarks, millennials were not growing up the way, at the same rate as Gen Xers or baby boomers did. And to me, that's the wrong conclusion. That's a missed
Hmm.
opportunity to what we needed to say is, what does growing up mean to a millennial compared to what it meant to a Gen Xer or a baby boomer? So of course there's a lot of very valid reasons why some millennials are waiting to buy houses. They may have a ton of student loan debt. They may want to be more mobile. They may, not define success as material possessions the way specifically many baby boomers were brought up to do. I love that question of how does different generations define success, what were the norms. So acquiring a bunch of stuff is a bit of is of its time, right? Like we're still very
Yeah.
consumerist culture, but certainly the number of Gen Xers and millennials inheriting baby boomers, you know, heirlooms is significant right now. I do a lot of work for financial advisors and insurance companies where it's like the millennials or the Gen Xers don't necessarily want all of the antique furniture and all of the
Hmm.
things that baby boomers spent their lives accumulating as sort of wealth and opportunity and success. So I think being careful about using your benchmarks for success, for being an adult, for all of those things and assuming they hold is really important. They might, and I also encourage people not to assume that they don't. But don't assume that your way of defining success has translated. I think that's a great question to ask to engage people across generations.
Hmm. I That's great. And so you just mentioned how we need to be resisting assumptions. Let's dive into the Gentelligent method. So you've identified 4 steps that will help people become more generationally intelligent. Take advantage of these opportunities. And I'll list them out and we'll go through them. But the first step you identified is to resist assumptions and then to adjust the lens, to strengthen trust, and then to expand the pie. Now we've touched on a lot of these things already, but let's talk about it through this method. So how would you talk about resisting assumptions?
So we call these practices because we believe they are things that we need to normalize as the way we're engaging across ages and across generations. So when we take that first practice of resisting assumptions, first I think we want to identify what assumptions, perhaps unconscious or implicit ones, we're carrying around, and that's not just against or for other ages, although that's what we'll think about right away. It's a best practice in any kind of diversity work. What implicit assumptions am I carrying around about those millennials or okay boomer? Like what automatic assumptions do I maybe not even think about that you hear people talking about at work? Like these these kids don't want to work. They've got no work ethic, right? I've heard all of these things, or, you know, boomers don't get that. And it's like these very broad brush assumptions. So hearing that, raising our awareness is, of course, the first step in fighting any kind of bias issue. So doing what we call an assumption audit on yourself, on your work team, asking those great questions. If you hear somebody say, like, you know, these young people have no work ethic. I heard that at a talk last week. And I said, help me understand what you mean by that. Right, is a great
Mm.
sort of let's dig into, like, all young people. How are you defining work ethic? And that sort of leads into part of identifying assumptions and resisting assumptions that I didn't necessarily realize would be so important when we originally came up with the practices. So yes, let's resist
Mm.
biases. But I think even more sticky is, what are we assuming people define the same way, regardless of their age or generation, where we might be wrong? So I gave the example already about growing up or success. But right now, flexible workplace, you know, that
Mm.
$100 million conversation around how
Yeah.
do we create a flexible workplace. Well, what does flexible workplace mean to you as a millennial who has young children? What does it mean to me as a Gen Xer who has an older child who doesn't need, he's not even a child anymore legally, who doesn't need the same kind of supervision, but I'm still raising him. And I have aging parents that I am somewhat
Mm.
responsible for helping out as well. And what does a flexible workplace mean for a Gen Z who's trying to figure out their professional identity? You know, what assumptions are we making about how we all define? We all want flexibility, but why and how that is defined is very different. So I really encourage organizations to choose some terms that they're throwing around a lot and stop and say, well, when I say communication, or I say, you know, flexibility or transparency or whatever the $1 million word is at your organization right now, what does that mean to you? And where do we have similarities or differences? Both are really important, I think, to identify. So those are some of the things we mean by that first practice. You want me
Mm.
to roll into the second one, or you?
I have a question about the
Sure.
second one, so please expand on it a bit.
Yeah, the second one's my favorite. So, adjust the lens, as you said, is our second practice. And this one actually comes from work in the cross cultural management field. So, think about the last time you traveled abroad, for example. You go in with this inherent understanding that you're going somewhere where people grew up differently than you did. And there's a high likelihood that means you might be misunderstood, you might misunderstand them. So you work a little harder to make sure that doesn't happen, or at least, you know, think about looking at things through the perspective of where you're at. So it's encouraging us to use that same kind of mindset when we're working across generations. This is by definition just a cultural difference. Somebody who grew up differently than you did might look at things differently, and we would assume that would be true, and we wouldn't be surprised. So, recognizing that we see things through our own generational norms, I use that phrase a lot, as you can tell, because it's better than, I think norms are a better place to sit than assumptions and stereotypes. So if the
Mm.
norm for a millennial was high achieving, you know, be all that you can be, get yourself to the front of the line, you're worth it, like we've invested in you, go make us proud. That's a different norm than a baby boomer who was taught, put your head down, keep your mouth shut until somebody tells you it's your turn. That's an entirely different workplace norm, and you could see how those could clash. So adjusting the lens is recognizing the norms you're walking around subscribing to and liking, and they're the ones that work for you, but also recognizing why those might not be the norms that other people subscribe to. So I have a power question that I've come up with to give people when I do talks, so they can right away try each practice and see if it works. So for adjust the lens, I love this idea of just asking people, help me understand. So I see something that does not make sense to me. I'm getting irritated or annoyed, or I think that's wrong. And I don't think you should do it that way. Stepping away from the judgment and saying, okay, clearly we look at this differently. Can you help me understand? Can you help me understand why you didn't respond to that email I sent you 3 days ago? Can you help me understand why the phone's out at the meeting? Can you help me understand why you don't want to come back into the workplace 2 days a week? Just as a starting point to adjust your lens to see perhaps what you aren't seeing from their perspective. We're not necessarily going to, take those norms on as the right ones, but we're going to try to understand them. So that's in a nutshell what adjusting the lens is all about.
The question I had for you on this is, as maybe personally or perhaps a bit as a millennial, I see myself as having a naturally more hopeful perspective on things. I suppose there are plenty of people in my cohort that are quite pessimistic, but I've found that it can really affect me when a leader or manager seems to be wrapped up in the what's pragmatic, what is realistic, being a little cynical at times. And so when I see a leader getting wrapped up in power struggles and just there's so much to be thinking about, I don't need another thing to be thinking about. How have you seen people make that switch to stop and just adjust the lens, to break out of regular patterns, ruts, even in their thinking?
Well, it's interesting because we can look at it either from how would we coach you to adjust your lens, or how would we coach, the older person in this scenario who maybe is like, I don't want to hear another idea. Like we got too much to deal with. Both probably it would be important. So
Yeah.
I think often when you so let's assume you're going to take the lead. You've read the book, you're the expert on this space. So adjusting your lens to think, why would they react that way? It's frustrating to me. I
Mm.
think new ideas are what we need to be encouraging, like optimism that we can do better or do different, but they're not clearly feeling that way. I wonder why. And so
Mm.
almost, it's we use the Walt Whitman, be curious, not judgmental, often attributed now to Ted Lasso, but actually from Walt Whitman, right? But, so if you got yourself in that mindset and you said, hey Dan, you know I'm sensing that it gets kind of frustrating to you when we continue to throw these ideas out. Like, talk to me about that. Like you're X number of years ahead of me. I imagine you've heard a lot of new ideas come and go. Like what is your thought on that? What is that frustrating to you when we meet your sort of practicality with maybe a little bit of wide-eyed idealism or optimism, or however you want to characterize it? Like I'm kind of sensing that. Is that accurate? Help me understand sort of your perspective when you get flooded with these new ideas, you know how you react to that. It'd be interesting to see, right? Is your assumption that they're being pragmatic and don't want to be bothered with your optimism and idealism accurate? Are they don't like the ideas, they don't think the ideas are going to work? Like, often that's the dynamic, is sort of like, here's this great new way we want to do it, well, that's never going to work, right? And then the whole thing shuts
Mm.
down. I
Yeah.
think younger people often forget to think about context. So, and I think older people get frustrated that you don't know what I know and you haven't asked. So it would be interesting to
Mm.
ask, like, hey, I have this idea. I think this would be great. Have you ever tried something like this before? Like, I'd love to hear the context on it. And my guess, could be wrong, but my guess is, once their experience and context on this is respected, or you acknowledge that things have come before you and that maybe you're not the first person to have this new idea, I do wonder if that resistance would go down because they feel
Mm.
heard, you respected their experience. Or we could jump ahead to a couple practices. My very so just to kind of, well, for the flow of the podcast, so the next two
Mm.
practices I'll kind of do together because that tends to be how they flow. So it's this idea of strengthening trust and expanding the pie. So maybe, once you realize there might be a reason why he's resistant to that or she's resistant to that, what do you do then? Because you might have this awesome amazing idea and it keeps getting shut down. So, strengthening trust is you want everybody in your organization, regardless of age, to have that psychological safety, to feel like they can share a really awesome idea without feeling like they're going to get shut down, which is sort of sensing what you're feeling. And also in that they could ask for help, right? If they don't know how to do something, that they, whether they're 60 or 26, could ask for help or take a risk without feeling like it's going to be detrimental. And the reason we included that was because we see older people being very comfortable sharing ideas. That's kind of they've earned the right to do that, but less comfortable asking for help because asking for help from people younger than you is not a norm that is very traditional. It used to be if you're in charge and you're older, you don't ask for help for people younger than you that won't respect you, which we now know isn't true. I ask for help from my students weekly, if not more often than that, on whatever I'm trying to learn or understand. And I would, go on a limb and say they respect me more because I'm willing to ask them, not less, that I don't feel
Mm.
like I need to know everything. But younger people are more comfortable asking for help. That's very role aligned with what we would expect from someone younger in an organization, but have become less willing to share all of their ideas. One, for the reason you gave, like, I'm tired of being shut down, but also very aware that that entitlement reputation is following them around. Like,
Mm.
I don't want to overstep, but I have this idea that I think is great. So strengthening trust is about normalizing everybody sharing ideas and asking for help in both directions. And expanding the pie is saying what would be possible if that was just absolutely fine, that your ideas aren't a threat to my experience and vice versa, that we're actually on the same side trying to create the best outcome for our organization. We could really make a win-win if we could combine your fresh perspective and my experience together. Then we've got something. So to just go full circle back to your question, my favorite Gentelligence power question is, how would you do it? So if this is a question asked by a younger person to an older one, so in your scenario, you have this great idea and you take a step back, you ask your older colleague about context. Has this been tried before? Like, do you get tired of hearing all these ideas? And then you say, well, if you were me and you had this idea that you really felt would be so great for the organization and would re-energize what we're doing, what would your advice be? How would you try to get some traction around this idea? So then that's very interesting because you're asking for their advice, which is a sign of respect. You genuinely want to know how they would introduce an idea like yours. And then you're building that trust that you believe you have something to learn from them. And 9 times out of 10, what happens is that older person gives you advice, which they're very qualified to give, and also becomes your ally because anytime somebody asks you for advice, you want them to be successful because you're there to guide them and they've asked you for help. The question also works the other way. So as an older person, if I'm in a meeting with younger colleagues or students and we talk about something we're trying to accomplish, and I turn to them and say, I'm really interested in how you would approach this, that's an entry point again to those kinds of conversations where they're going to share 10 things. Great wild-eyed ideas, some of which aren't practical, some of which aren't going to work, but some of them might, or a part of one might, and I'm going to learn from them, and then I can say, "Oh, I love that, but Sam, I have some questions about how we would actually make that work. So let's talk through those."
Mm,
And suddenly we're expanding that pie where your idea and my career stage and experience are going to work together for mutual benefit. So that's kind of the practices applied to your question. That's the hope.
yeah. I appreciate that you bring some of that up at the last bit, because I'm reminded of some lean principles where there's going to be a stage where we generate a bunch of ideas and then we try to implement it. And in that process of figuring out what's going to work, there can be this ongoing conversation. But on either side of, okay, we're making this decision, now is the time for us to just be managed as a team. Because I think I've noticed this not only in organizations, but also in couples that I've actually coached at times, where there's a mismatch between what they're expecting this part of the conversation is going to be. Are we talking just about ideas, or are we talking about let's actually get it done? And so there's so many different angles to having these conversations that can add up or subtract the overall uh, product.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let me ask you, when reading through your book and understanding this Gentelligent method, the first part of it, resist assumptions, stood out to me because I've understood behavioral psychology and the way a lot of self improvement people talk about getting better, that it's not enough to simply get rid of a bad habit. You need to replace it with a better habit
Mm-hmm.
for it to stick.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were to attempt to sum up some of these things we talked about into better assumptions, what kind of assumptions could we walk away with from this conversation to replace with probably the more stereotypical ideas that people hold?
Yeah, excellent. All right, Sam. So I think that would be the mantra of Gentelligence would be every generation has something to teach and something to learn. So if we could normalize that assumption that it's not odd to learn something from people younger than you, especially when we think about rate of change. It's not just technology, but that tends to be what we think of. That it's a stereotype that older people can't learn technology or aren't good at technology. It's not a stereotype that our motivation to necessarily learn it is lower because we're not sure we need it. It's,
Mm,
it's types of intelligence, all kinds of interesting things there. But if it makes absolute sense that if I want to learn a new app or a software or a tool or a social media or anything that's new, who would be a great person to help me learn that? Someone who maybe grew up learning that very naturally as part of their development is going to have sort of a second nature around that. And if I can normalize asking for help and input from someone younger than me, there's all kinds of benefits beyond just learning that we've talked about today, the trust, the mutual respect. And when you're asked for help, you become engaged. You have skin in the game. This is our project or our conversation or our organization. I'm part of this. I'm valued. The number one reason people leave their jobs is because they don't feel valued. So I think the idea that every generation has something to teach. We I think still inherently believe older people have things to teach younger people, but then also things to learn. That younger people, of course, have lots to learn, and so do older people. That's how we stay engaged. That's how we stay energetic and excited about our lives and our careers. And I think we need to normalize that. That's the assumption that should be the default in our society and our organizations, that we're not in competition. We instead have this fantastic kind of diversity of thought and experience that comes with living in a multi generational society and having a multi generational workforce. And that's why while I'm always fascinated by the narratives and norms of different generations, we're always going to have different generations. There's always going to be a younger generation coming up with different norms and different experiences. So just taking the assumption that generations are a great kind of diversity in the workplace. They're a difference to be valued, not one to be feared or aggravated by. I think is the assumption and the norm that Gentelligence would hope we get to, as a society, but also just in the workplace. That aren't we lucky that we have different perspectives and experiences to tap into?
I love that. And as a researcher of generational differences, age diversity, having all of these conversations and sometimes being met with resistance, I assume requires quite a bit of courage. And so to wrap things up, Megan, let me ask you, what does courage mean to you?
Mm. I think courage is about being willing to think about things in a new way. I think it is the willingness to put out there a different lens for people to consider, but also to be okay with everybody meeting that where they're at. So I'm always excited when I leave a talk or a conversation or a workshop where someone says, "Well, I've never thought about it that way." That's really why I do what I do. I don't need someone to always agree. I think that that's how we learn and grow and figure out different ways to think about things. But I think courage is about putting a different lens out there, and that's what I think Gentelligence really is we haven't been looking at this in a way that's optimistic and proactive and useful. We've all, been fed this idea that we're locked in a generational war and that we're all competing, when instead there's a very different and much more productive way to look at it. So that's what I think courage is being willing to say, well, I've got a different lens for everybody to try. Are we willing to think about it maybe in this new way?
Wow. Is there anything else before we close this conversation that needs to be brought up?
I think we have a lot of opportunities. We're in the midst of the greatest management and leadership shift of our lifetime, and we are preparing people for jobs that don't exist yet. We have very interesting challenges that we're all trying to figure out. And I think there's never been a better time for us to have all hands on deck and really thinking about, how if we were starting with a blank slate on how we work and how we manage people and how we work together, which in some ways we are, what would be a way to do it that we could have people across their lifespan, across their careers, feel valued for the perspective and experience that they bring to the workplace? I think that to me is really such an opportunity, and I hope that we start looking at it that way.
I agree. Where can people connect with you?
You can find me on my website. So it's www.profgerhardt.com. And also, I'm on Instagram at Prof. Gerhardt. I have an online training academy called Gentelligence Academy you can check out as well. So, and of course, I'm on LinkedIn. So, you can find me lots of
Hmm.
places.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. I'm Sam, the Courage Coach for Executives. And remember, it starts with you.